888-985-5895. Our first guest this morning is Ashley Edwards, former president and CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Council. He is a column contributor for us here at SuperTalk News, an entrepreneur on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. Good morning, Ashley.
Hey, good morning, Richard. How are you this morning?
Doing well. Appreciate some of your time. You worked on Governor Barber's staff years ago. We'll get into some hurricane response stuff in a little bit, but I'm curious, your thoughts as we are now not quite a dozen hours removed from last night's vice presidential debate.
Well, I'll tell you, first and foremost, it strikes me that for those of us that are just political watchers that love this stuff, it becomes very much a spectator sport. And so every 4 years, we get our version of the Olympics, which is a U.S. presidential race. And so, the debates become part of that. Now, along those lines, last night was really one of the tough ones because I had to double screen the vice presidential debate with the Braves playoff game in San Diego.
I don't think you were the only one.
So it was difficult kind of going back and forth. But I'll tell you, it was really an interesting debate, and I think the biggest takeaway that I had was it felt like a return to pre-Trump era political debates. I mean, the level of animus that you see in the Trump debate, the meanness, it all just faded away. And these were two men who probably used the word "I agree with you" more than I've heard in American politics for the last 8 years. And so there's that there was just a real tone change from what we saw. Now, I think J.D. Vance did very well. He's obviously a very polished debater, and really did a favor for himself considering just how much the discussion in this country has been that was he the wrong pick? His numbers are in the tank in terms of approval ratings, but I actually have a feeling you're going to see that tick up some because I think what J.D. Vance, was successfully able to do last night was really try to gear all of his answers in indicting Kamala Harris and the Harris administration and Harris policies, and in many ways sort of launder some of the things that are often criticized about MAGA or Project 2025 to make them not sound so crazy. And so in some ways, he made the Tim Walz line, about these guys are weird, really kind of work against him because I think a lot of the American people that may not know a lot about Vance or may have not seen him a lot were probably left watching that saying, well, this guy doesn't seem particularly weird at all.
Yeah.
And in that way, I certainly think Vance was the winner, although, and I think Walz came out very shaky in the beginning, probably finished off a lot better.
Agreed.
But despite that, these vice presidential debates probably don't really move the needle a lot in the grand scheme of things. I don't think it changes the race, but it's certainly fun to just kind of talk about the conjecture around who won, who lost. Does it change the race at all? Probably not.
Yeah, historically, vice presidential debates don't change the outcome of races, but in one that appears to be as close in some swing states as this is, who knows? Maybe it does swing a few voters, and that ends up being the difference. To your point about decorum just a second ago, I thought J.D. Vance, and please hear what I'm saying and don't say that I'm comparing the two, I thought there were some Barack Obama qualities to his presence and his tone and his delivery. Regardless of how you feel about Barack Obama, he's one of the great orators that we've seen and one of the great debaters that we've seen. I thought J.D. Vance, he never got his feathers ruffled. He never showed frustration. He just stayed very even-keeled, and that's really palatable to a lot of people.
No question. I think that's an incredibly astute point, and I think you are absolutely right on target with that. Look, there were many times last night that I found myself saying, goodness, if if J.D. Vance was at the top of the ticket, I think he would be a far better spokesman in many ways than Donald Trump is for this. Now, Trump is a
Ashley, my mother texted me last night. I was running late on getting started. I had to get kids to bed, and my mother texted me. She said, "I wish these were the two guys running for president."
I think a lot of people watching the debate probably had that same feeling, because I think at the end of the day, you saw this contrast. I mean, Tim Walz is a very folksy guy, not nearly as polished. And let me just say, in the lead up to the debate, one of the things that I was keying in on was a lot of Democratic strategists and a lot of pundits were sort of trying to manage expectations. They were talking about, Walz is nervous. He's not a polished debater. He didn't go to Yale Law School. He's at a disadvantage. And so you wonder going into it, is that just sort of trying to create a really low bar of expectation so that hopefully he will overperform? And I think in retrospect, there was a lot of truth to it. That's what we saw on the stage. They were in a little bit of a different class in terms of just the quality of being an orator, of being able to debate, of being able to really sell your points. I think that Walz probably had some appeal. However, I don't think I think probably the main thing in a vice presidential debate is do everything you can to be a proxy for your candidate, attack the top of the ticket on the other side, and do no harm. And in that way, I don't think Walz did anything that, is just catastrophic. But certainly, J.D. Vance, wins that debate hands down in a straight-up comparison of the two.
Actually, one of the things that stood out to me last night and I find really interesting, I understand that when you're in a situation like this, you've got to call on some of your own experiences to try to prop up what you're saying and why you're saying it. I thought Tim Walz talked more about Minnesota than he did about Kamala Harris last night.
He did talk a lot about Minnesota. It's really interesting because, Minnesota, as much as, probably the folks in the Midwest sort of believe that Minnesota is the heartland, I don't think that Mississippians or swing state voters in Georgia or North Carolina really have, much in terms of understanding Minnesota or Minnesota culture or Minnesota reality. And so sort of basing everything on Minnesota probably doesn't have the mass appeal that he thinks it does. And in many ways, I think that was probably a losing strategy for him. It was interesting, conversely, that you didn't hear J.D. Vance talk about Ohio constantly. You didn't hear him talk about Appalachia constantly. J.D. Vance sort of seemed like an everyman. He was really, really good in the debate. There again, I think that Tim Walz, I think that the folksiness scores. I'm a guy that's a former competitive debater from my younger days, and so I watch these things with an eye and an ear toward, who is really sort of maneuvering very well in the debate and technically getting it right. But I look at some of the post-debate polls, and they were split, 51-49, sort of equal down the lines. And so I think that folksiness probably plays a little bit, but I think it probably has a lot more appeal in the Midwest swing states than what you would get in the Sun Belt or out west in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, places of that nature.
I understand that all politicians kind of tell at least part of the truth. They use the high points of policies to make points. They selectively grab things. I understand that happens on both sides of the aisle. The thing with Tim Walz and his trouble with the truth is he seems to lie when it doesn't matter. And I don't know. I don't understand why. It makes me wonder, okay, well, what else is he not telling the truth about? So he's got that folksy grandpa characteristic, but then he just lies about the fact that he was in China during the Tiananmen Square protests and massacre in 1989, when in truth he was in Nebraska. And there are other things where his military service record, it's just not true. His coaching, was he a head coach? Was he assistant coach? He just doesn't tell the truth. And I don't understand why on things that are trivial, he doesn't tell the truth. But it makes you wonder, okay, when stuff really matters, what's going to happen? Got a minute for you to respond.
Well, look, my old boss, Haley Barber, used to say, it's one thing to step on your toe. It's another thing to jump up and down on it. And Tim Walz is definitely a guy who has done some jumping up and down on his own toes here. And you're absolutely right. It is a glaring weakness, and he's sort of allowed a chink in his armor that is easily exploited by this stuff. It doesn't really make any sense because the lies that he's told, they're not moving the needle if they were the truth in the first place. So what's the point? I think you're absolutely correct on that.
Ashley, you got time to hang for a couple more minutes for us to talk some hurricane response?
Yeah, sure, absolutely.
All right, quick time out. We got more coming up on the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi. Richard Cross in for Paul Gallo. Ashley Edwards from the Mississippi Gulf Coast is my guest. We're back right after this. Back with you on the Gallo Radio Show. Richard Cross in for Paul this morning. Ashley Edwards is our guest, and this is a really timely conversation. Ashley, I appreciate you hanging on through the break. Really wanted to get some of your perspective on hurricane recovery efforts. And also, you've got experience working in the port in Mississippi, and maybe some thoughts on this longshoreman strike and kind of the real effect that this may have. Post-Hurricane Katrina, you were on Governor Barber's staff and ultimately led the effort for recovery on the Mississippi Gulf Coast. When you look at the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, what is your reaction to the response so far by the federal government and some of the other entities that are involved? And what's ahead for the people of western North Carolina and eastern Tennessee, North Georgia, and parts of Florida that Florida kind of feels forgotten in all of this story because of the focus on the flooding there in the Appalachians. As you look at this, what are you seeing right now?
Well, I'm so glad we're talking about this. I'm actually calling in today and not on the webcam because I'm up in North Georgia as we speak. It's the incredible parallel to Hurricane Katrina. For those of us who lived through Katrina on the coast, you could watch images on television, and as terrible as they looked, if you were there in person, you knew that small screen could not even begin to tell the story of just how devastating it actually was. And the same thing is absolutely true with Hurricane Helene. This is historic flooding, historic damage throughout the entire Appalachian chain. We're talking towns that have been entirely wiped out, a lot of these small mountain towns. Flash flooding is always a big problem in these mountain communities. This will likely go down as the single worst flood event in American history in the Appalachians. When you look at the impact to infrastructure, entire sections of interstate and U.S. highways being washed out, entire water and sewer systems filled with mud and sediment, entire towns that are going to have to be rebuilt, schools, hospitals, grocery stores, gas lines completely shut down. This is very Katrina-like in that it is going to take years, decades in some cases, for these communities to recover. And I think that by the time it's all said and done with, this will end up being one of the top 3 or 4 most expensive hurricanes in American history in terms of the total recovery cost. And, it's really interesting when you consider, Hurricane Helene had a lot of impact right where it made landfall in coastal Florida and then up throughout the state of Georgia. But that has almost taken a back seat now to this historic flooding in the Appalachians. But it's such a very large disaster in terms of geographic scale. It's going to require an incredible federal response. It's going to require hundreds of billions of dollars in federal supplemental appropriations. And this is one of those things that the communities that have gone through this will still be talking about 100 years from now.
It's interesting that you draw that parallel to, North Georgia and Florida kind of forgotten. It's like the whole Mississippi is a landmass, right? With all the focus on New Orleans and Louisiana and the focus on the Florida Gulf Coast post Katrina, and it was like, oh yeah, maybe part of that was because you and Governor Barber and all the people that were part of that team did such a good job in terms of our response to that and working with the federal government. But I mean, in the same way that all politics is local to a certain degree, tragedy is local too. And I mean, those people in the Tampa, St. Pete area and in Cedar Key and then up into North Georgia where you are now, they are dealing with devastation on the same level, but it's not necessarily getting the same coverage.
Oh, absolutely correct. I mean, when you look at the impacts along the west coast of Florida, just from the feeder bands and the onshore flow of the winds pushing up surge, I mean, you had record flooding in Tampa Bay. I mean, higher levels than have ever been recorded on some of these flood gauges. Incredible flooding in St. Petersburg. One of our clients in our disaster recovery business is Fort Myers Beach, which is much farther south down in Florida, almost to Naples. And, they had floods that inundated their Times Square and downtown and downtown businesses. And so that entire west coast of Florida received an incredible amount of flood damage, which if that had been the only impacts from this hurricane, it would have been substantial. Then you consider the inland impacts up through Valdosta, Georgia, all the way north of Atlanta, and then through the Appalachians into Tennessee and North Carolina and South Carolina. This is a disaster on a massive, massive scale. And so, and look, you asked earlier, how's the government responding? And I always tell people, these politically in times like this, these events are ripe for criticism because it's almost impossible for government to get it right. I mean, government is also very limited in what they can do, especially immediately in the aftermath. And when you have something of this scale, in some ways, they're just as helpless as well. One other thing I just want to quickly point out, we were talking about the vice presidential debate earlier.
Yeah.
And, don't underestimate the impact that this could have on the presidential race going forward, because certainly there's going to be a lot of opportunity to criticize the current administration, and that will inevitably come. Also, I think one thing to keep in mind, North Carolina is a swing state. It's very much in play in terms of the presidential election. And the western half of North Carolina, especially the city of Asheville and its suburbs, is really a blue center politically of North Carolina, sort of a liberal enclave up in the Appalachians. And given the level of devastation they're experiencing, there's no question that it is going to affect voting outcomes in November. And so that in itself could potentially be an influencing factor in who ultimately wins this presidential race.
Not only affecting outcomes, but could affect turnout, just because of the ongoing issues that are there. Only a couple of minutes left, Ashley. I was kind of reading through your bio and looking at some of the things that you've done, and noticed that you worked with the Hancock County Port and Harbor Commission. Curious from that perspective, you see this longshoreman strike. The port in Mississippi, thankfully, is not affected, but so many across the East Coast and into the Gulf states are. There's a lot of talk about interruptions to the supply chain if this lasts for more than a week or two. Based on your experience, what are you seeing here? What is your biggest concern?
I think this could be economically devastating. I think that people that don't have visibility on logistics, trade, and transportation operations and the role that ports play in that, they just can't comprehend how this is going to affect the logistics services and operations. So many of the products that we use on a day-to-day basis are coming in through these ports, especially these East Coast ports. Yeah. And so every day that these are not in operation, every day containers are not being unloaded, offloaded, and shipped inland, you're going to see prices go up. You're going to see availability issues. You're going to see lots of impacts throughout the supply chain. In some ways, this is much more devastating than, say, a strike with an auto workers union, because we have an inventory of automobiles, and so a relatively short-term strike is not going to absolutely kill the car industry in America. this will have immediate and lasting impacts. And the longer this lasts, look out, it could be really economically disruptive.
And another issue that could very well be a big part of this election, it's fascinating to me because this is a pro-union administration. Democrats generally pro-union. And so they can't necessarily afford to just go in and try to blow up the union and end the strike. But at the same time, if the economy is suffering, I think Vice President Harris in particular, because she's on the ticket, finds herself in a really difficult spot with the potential lengthy strike here.
Well, it is a difficult spot, and it's coming on the heels of the Fed lowering interest rates because they see economic cooling that's helping with inflation. And, this could certainly create sort of an economic ripple that's going to affect monetary policy, that's going to affect the presidential election. I mean, this is a very, very big deal. And, of course, it's sort of playing third fiddle on the news right now. So the bombing that's going on in Israel and the presidential race and everything else. But this is one of those things that can move the needle very quickly in our economy.
38 sea vessels are currently anchored in harbors or outside of harbors along the East Coast, just waiting for an opportunity to unload. Ashley, really appreciate your insight, appreciate your time. Wish you the best and safety and safe travels as you work with the recovery effort in North Georgia. Thanks so much.
Great being with you today. Thank you.
Ashley Edwards, former president and CEO of the Gulf Coast Business Alliance, working in the recovery space as well right now. Really good conversation there. We'll wrap up the 7 o'clock hour with you when we come back. This is the Gallo Radio Show on SuperTalk Mississippi.